For many years, I have been asked to present a topic after lunch to the Bournemouth Ladies Luncheon Group. They've actually been going for 80 years. I haven't been working for them that long, but I'm certainly getting to the point where I'm not quite sure what to offer them because obviously they want something fairly local to Bournemouth. We've done gardens, we've done houses, and I was searching around for a suitable topic, and I suddenly remembered that Mary Shelley is actually buried in the churchyard of St Peter's in the centre of Bournemouth, which you can see top right. And then it occurred to me that Robert Louis Stevenson actually wrote Jekyll and Hyde whilst he was living in Bournemouth before he left England finally to go to America. And we won't be able to go to his burial place because, believe it or not, it's in Samoa. And then Beardsley briefly lived in Bournemouth, first in Boscombe and then in the centre of Bournemouth, before finally giving up and going to Monton, where sadly he would die. And I certainly thought there was a very interesting confluence of authors and monsters coming together in Bournemouth. The main thing that actually binds them all together is ill health. Robert Louis Stevenson came to Bournemouth to try and to recover his health, as did Oscar Aubrey Beardsley. And it wasn't, in fact, Bram Stoker who went to Bournemouth to recover his health, but his boss, Henry Irving, the most famous actor, tragic actor of the 19th century. So unless you know about Mary Shelley being in the churchyard at St Peter's, you might be a little bemused walking past the Wetherspoons in Bournemouth, where you'll see the sign for the pub, Mary Shelley, and that iconic image of Boris Karloff as the monster. Even today, people get confused between Frankenstein, that is not the name of the monster. He was simply known in the original as the creature. And it is, of course, Dr. Frankenstein who creates him. And it was Boris Karloff who created that iconic image with the bolts through his neck and the flat head. And it looks like his lips have been stitched together. And in fact, it was such an iconic image that the studio actually copyrighted it. So nobody else could perform using this distinctive look. And in fact, there were two films that used the Boris Karloff image of the creature or the monster. The film dates to 1931 and was based on a play by the wonderfully named Peggy Webbling. And the play played a little bit fast and loose with the original story. Dr. Frankenstein's assistant, there's always an assistant, isn't there, mistakenly puts the wrong brain into the creature. It is the brain of a murderer. And so Karloff very much sort of creates this image of, let's be honest, a sort of mentally impaired creature. There is the wonderful poster, The Man Who Made a Monster. That is the poster for 1931. But let us go back to Mary Shelley, because how does she actually end up in Bournemouth? So, of course, she was born, her maiden name, she was born Godwin, and her mother was the famous feminist Mary Wollstonecraft. Her father was William Godwin. They were both radical. Mary Wollstonecraft wrote or supported the rights of women, and William Godwin was equally politically active and is often said to be the originator of the concept of anarchy. So not surprisingly, Mary grew up in a rather strange, politically charged environment. Unfortunately, her birth resulted in her mother's death. Just a few days after the birth of Mary, her mother will die from something that affected many women, basically septicemia, after the birth of her childbirth fever, as it was often known, after the birth of Mary. This is a portrait of Mary Shelley as she'll become on the left-hand side, and her mother, Mary Wollstonecraft, is down the bottom, looking very revolutionary in a sort of white chemise. She must have been a pretty tough woman to have a conversation with. Now, Percy Bysshe Shelley comes into Mary Godwin's life through her father. Shelley was a radical already when he discovered the writings of William Godwin and basically became something of Godwin's protege. He saw Godwin as a mentor. But unfortunately, that brought him into contact with the young Mary, who was only 16 years old. Percy had already got a very wild background. He'd run off with his first wife, Harriet, married her in Edinburgh. He will have children by Harriet. In fact, he lived such a dissolute lifestyle that he was disinherited by his father, Sir Timothy, and sort of supporting his lifestyle was always going to be a problem for Percy Shelley. He will elope with Mary Godwin. He's still married, so it's an adulterous affair, and they won't marry until 1816 after the suicide of his first wife, Harriet. Yes, cheerful tale. I'm showing you here Joseph Seven's posthumous portrait of Shelley, writing Prometheus Unbound. So I want to remind you that the full title of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein includes, of course, the theme of Prometheus, who, unfortunately, having brought fire to earth, is punished by the gods. He is tied to a rock. Every night an eagle comes down and consumes his liver, only for it to regrow and for Prometheus to be put through the same torture the next night. And obviously, Prometheus Unbound was this idea, essentially, of Prometheus escaping from the wrath of the gods, reinventing himself, which, of course, you might see as a theme of Frankenstein, because, as we're about to discover, it's very much about the sort of duality of man, or man usurping the role of God. There are all sorts of psychological pre-Freudian twists that you can put on the Frankenstein tale. In 1822, however, young Percy is drowned in the Gulf of Spezia, which is near Viareggio, which is near Florence, if you're trying to work out the geography of Italy. He's returning by boat from a visit to Byron, and he dies essentially because he cannot swim. He was only 28. Fournier's famous portrayal of the funeral of Shelley on the beach is actually in the Walker Art Gallery. It dates to 1889. You can't see Mary Shelley there because, as would have been the tradition of the era, she was very much in the background. It was very much an all-male affair. But Shelley's body is burnt, as you can see, rather Viking style, and the ashes of his heart are collected and sent back to Mary in England, and they too will be placed in that joint plot at St. Peter's. In the end, there will be Mary Shelley, her parents, Mary Wollstonecraft and William Godwin moved from the old cemetery at St. Pancras, and the ashes of Shelley's heart. So the entire Shelley family will end up in the churchyard at St. Peter's. I wanted to show you this wonderful memorial, which was commissioned by Lady Jane Shelley. She was the widow of Mary's only surviving child. She lost at least 3 other children, either through stillbirth or dying shortly after being born. And this loss of life must be taken into account. Her mother's premature death, the death of all her children, must have played very heavily on her when we think about the conception of man transforming himself into God and having the ability to create life. Mary was in life surrounded by death. But Lady Jane Shelley here, the widow of Percy Florence Shelley, so named because that was where he was born in Florence, was commissioned to produce this Edward Onslow Ford for the University College, Oxford, to commemorate the 1 year that Shelley was actually at university in Oxford. He didn't fare very well. He wrote a pamphlet about being an atheist and was thrown out of the college. Nevertheless, having become a famous poet, the college was more than happy to have this monument instated to him. It is quite magnificent, though Lady Shelley really wanted it to go to Florence. I think that was probably a rather foolish idea, as it's extremely large. So, knowing that his mother was ailing, Sir Percy Florence Shelley bought Boscombe Lodge, a quite handsome house. It's still with us in Boscombe, but it is now a medical centre and a theatre, because Sir Percy was mad keen on the theatre, and in fact would also build a theatre on Tite Street. Again, ironically, the same road that, of course, Oscar Wilde lived on in the 1880s. Anyway, he bought Boscombe Lodge to turn this into a home for his mother, but Mary Shelley died prematurely before she could enjoy it, and we assume that, I'm afraid, she died of something like cancer. Anyway, here they all are, the entire family: Mary Wollstonecraft, William and Mary Wollstonecraft Godwin, the widow, of course, of Sir Percy. So everybody in the family will end up in the churchyard at St. Peter's. And you can see on the blue plaque, the heart of Percy Bysshe Shelley, a poet, which, remember, came in the form of ashes. Very dramatic. Now, they lived a pretty dissolute life. There was a lot of boyfriend-girlfriend swapping, if I can put it that way. But we will find, in fact, Mary Shelley, as she will become, she had not yet married him in 1814, but we'll find Mary Godwin and Percy Shelley moving through war-torn Europe just immediately after the Napoleonic War in 1814. They were escaping from their creditors and trying to live cheaply. Their travels took them along the River Rhine to stop at Gershheim, which is where you will find the castle of Frankenstein, which might, of course, have given Mary Shelley an idea for the title of her story. Very famously, 2 centuries before, an alchemist had been engaged in various experiments at Frankenstein Castle. Remember, alchemists were more like magicians. Think of John Dee. One of their jobs was to try and make gold out of lead. And one very famous German alchemist by the name of Bottger actually managed to create white gold, as it became known. So rather than creating real gold, he created the recipe for true porcelain. So alchemists were often to be found in the sort of superior European courts, hopefully coming up with the method of creating gold out of a base metal. Anyway, it's pretty atmospheric, doesn't it? Castle Frankenstein. So that may be where the name comes from. But the story itself can be tracked back to the rainy summer of 1816, known as the year without a summer. The world was locked in a long, cold period caused by the eruption of Mount Tambora. Remember when we had the ash cloud from Iceland a few years ago? So our group of friends were rather locked down in their villa, which was on Lake Geneva. Lord Byron was staying at the Via Diodati, and they all get together one night to tell ghost stories. Claire Claremont was there. She's Mary's stepsister and will also be a lover of Byron. And so too John Polidori, which is where I start to get interested, because he had a nephew who you might know of very well, William Michael Rossetti. John Polidori was his uncle. And Polidori was also telling stories, and the story that he will tell during this fateful night on Lake Geneva will become the first vampire story. Many people claimed that Byron wrote it, but even Byron was prepared to stand up and declare that Polidori was the first to ever think about the concept of a vampire. And all these fruitful ideas came from reading ghost stories, German ghost stories, translated into French from the Phantasmagoria of 1812. An atmospheric image of the Villa Diodati down the bottom and how it looks today. I like the moon, the full moon, making it look very spooky. There is no doubt, with the aid of my little gift here, that Mary was inspired in her story by the new discoveries of Luigi Galvani. Remember that through Byron and their circle, they were very well informed. Particularly any new scientific discoveries took their, they were interested. So Galvani had come up with animal electricity. He discovered that if he touched a frog's leg with a copper probe, he could make it look as though it came to life. And of course, my little gift is showing you that the frog is very dead, but the nerve end can be activated with an electric current. So during one evening, during this very dull summer, Mary, of course, thinks about the principle of life. Perhaps a corpse could be reanimated using galvanism. Galvanism had given a token of such things. So now the various elements in the story are coming together. And of course, in the film, the body of the monster is reanimated with lightning courtesy, by the way, of Scott. And here we are in the famous Boris Karloff version. Here's Dr. Frankenstein famously crying out, "It's alive, it's alive." He probably wished that it wasn't later on in the film. However, the original monster, as illustrated in Theodor von Holst in 1831, was nothing like the monster created by Boris Karloff, which was positively horrific with the bolts and the flat head. In fact, Theodor von Holst's monster is rather beautiful, as you can see here on the left-hand side. The only indication of the morbidity of the story is the bones and the skull that you can see around him. But he's got what you and I would call a six-pack. You can see the sort of like bone structure and tendons of his hand and his leg, but he certainly isn't monstrous in the way that Boris Karloff portrays the creature. And in fact, in the version of Frankenstein that took to the stage, I love it here, written by R.B. Peake. This is the front cover of 1823. I love it. It's called Presumption or the Fates of Frankenstein. The presumption, of course, being the fact that one shouldn't presume to be God. And you can see here that the creature is actually really rather beautiful. He's very big, but he has a lovely head of curls and looks quite magnificent, as does Jacob Elordi, who is, of course, the recent monster created for Del Toro's long adaptation of Frankenstein, but very well worth the watch. It tells the story in two sections. Frankenstein's story first of creating the creature and basically coming to realize the error of his ways. And then the second part tells the story of the creature who feels abandoned by his master. So it's the duality, really, the sort of like good and bad sides of man, and also usurping this concept of God. So Jacob Elordi here, and coming over the top of it, and equally beautiful, as you can see, front cover for Frankenstein of 1875. Again, I love his curls. He's also very large, as you can see, but he's not monstrous in the way that Boris Karloff portrays the creature. This is an illustration from John Coulthard, which shows the denouement of the story when they meet in the frozen north. Again, another metaphor, really, for the whole sort of concept of life out of death, the frozen north. And this is, of course, how Del Toro's film starts. The jagged ice makes me immediately think of paintings by Caspar David Friedrich, and the boat is trapped, or I should say the ship is trapped in the ice. And then the quote from Frankenstein: "I perceived, as the shape came nearer, sight tremulous and abhorred, that it was the wretch whom I had created. I trembled with rage and horror, resolving to wait his approach and then close with him in mortal combat," trying to sort of like bring the story to its end by sort of mutual destruction by all accounts in the film version. And here, courtesy again of Scott, we have a rather lovely snowy scene, and we have the front of the cover for the DVD, in fact, for Frankenstein, with those broken, jagged lumps of ice in the background. Don't let me put you off it. I thoroughly recommended it. It's a good watch on a Sunday afternoon with lots of popcorn. So Mary Shelley will end up in that churchyard, and then a few years later, along will come Robert Louis Stevenson, who will actually write the story of the strange case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde in Bournemouth. Is there something in the water? Interestingly enough, this can also be seen as a form of duality, again, good and bad fighting within the same man. And Stevenson might well have been inspired again by contemporary novels and other literature, scientific literature of the era, which was discussing this whole idea of what created evil, what made a man evil and what made sure that he stayed good, which was essentially Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde is a moral tale. This is the first edition of 1886. Robert Louis Stevenson comes from a wealthy Scottish background. His father was an engineer and best known for creating lighthouses. More of that later. I get the impression that father would have liked son to have entered a similar well-established and quite lucrative profession, but no, he wanted to be an artist. And he goes off to Paris with his cousin Bob. In my photograph here, Bob is the character with the wonderful stripy socks. And Robert Louis Stevenson, with the walking stick and looking equally dandy and jaunty, is standing next to him. Stevenson again acquired or contracted tuberculosis at a young age. Travel was seen to be one of the ways to overcome his debilitating illness. He will, of course, eventually die from it, but in Samoa. In the spring of 1875, he decides to canoe. Yes, I did say canoe, down a variety of Belgian and French rivers, ending up at Grace-Chiloane, which is near Fontainebleau. He'll eventually recount this adventure in Forest Notes. But we see him here on the lawn of the Hotel Chevillon, with all sorts of artists gathered around him. I'd like to know who the others are. Many artists go to Grace-Chiloane to paint, like Sir John Lavery. But even more important is the rather jauntily seated figure on the canoes, who is Fanny Osborne. She will, in fact, become a major figure in the life of Robert Louis Stevenson. She's actually sat on the canoes. I rather like that. Here she is, Frances Matilda van der Grift, that was her maiden name, Osborne. She doesn't have a very happy marriage. She has 3 children by Mr. Osborne, but then decides, because she is financially independent, to go to Paris to learn to become an artist. And she, like many, will drift towards Grace-Chiloane, which was a popular place to paint over the summer holidays. And in 1876, whilst visiting Grace-Chiloane, she will meet Robert Louis Stevenson. So you can see her here. A striking looking woman is how I think I will mention it. But there was 10 years between the two, and it's often said that Fanny seduced Stevenson. In this photograph, we actually see the newlyweds. So Fanny will eventually choose Stevenson. They have a bit of a tug of war. Stevenson can't raise the money to marry her. He can't even raise the money to go and see her in America. But eventually she decides to divorce Osborne, and in May 1880, they are married in San Francisco. In the photograph, we can see Fanny. She's here on the left-hand side. Then the stepdaughter will become his literary assistant. She is Isabel Osborne. And the lady who you wouldn't argue with is his mother, very dour-looking Scotswoman, Margaret Isabel Stevenson. I also like the wallpaper in the background. Fanny has a huge influence on Stevenson's writing, as we're about to discover. But again, fearing for his health, Fanny and Stevenson moved to Branksome Park in a suburb of Bournemouth in 1884 until they acquire a better house. Thomas Stevenson buys a house, in fact, technically for his daughter-in-law as a wedding present. It's named Skerryvore after his famous lighthouse, which he had of course, helped to construct. Originally, the house was at 61 Alum Chine. A chine, I'll explain in a minute. It's a type of dune with trees on it, very specific to Bournemouth, but Alum Chine Road. And they will live at Skerryvore until 1887, when they embark on a voyage that will take them to America and eventually to Samoa, where Stevenson will die. Don't go looking for the home. Skerryvore, I'm afraid, was struck by bombing back in the Second World War, and a park now sort of marks where it was. My painting of it here, which shows it a rather rambling arrangement in terms of its architecture, painting dates 1898. This is an equally charming image of Skerryvore, 1912 in date, by Leslie Moffat Ward, a local Bournemouth artist. I do like the lines of poetry down the bottom, which I'm assuming are from Robert Louis Stevenson. With that last bit, such clay as artists fashioned, and such wood as the tree climbing urchin breaks. Takes a rather romantic image of Skerryvore. But all you'll find today, if you go to visit, is the garden laid out to mark the spot. In 1957, there's a little miniature lighthouse, that's Skerryvore, of course, and a plaque with a portrait of Stevenson. And it says, as you can see, overlooking this chine. So these chines in Bournemouth are very distinctive. They are huge dunes covered with trees, often pine trees. It's one of the reasons that many people went to Bournemouth. It was said that the air there was particularly good. So if you were suffering from any lung condition like TB, it was an ideal place to go to recover. The bridge that you're looking at there is actually infamous because according to one local shaggy dog story, Winston Churchill fell off that bridge in his late teens, broke very many parts of his body, and quite frankly, was very lucky to survive. Anyway, we know that the three most distinctive portrayals of Stevenson are courtesy of John Singer Sargent, who had known Stevenson since those early days in Paris. There are three portraits. This is the second, actually painted in Skerryvore in Bournemouth, where his star was beginning to rise. And of course, it will be Jekyll and Hyde that really ensures that his star goes meteoric. What is particularly interesting is Fanny in the corner, who's wearing a really outrageous outfit. It looks like she's off to some sort of fancy dress party. She's got a gilded gold headdress. It looks like she might be wearing a sari. It's definitely rather anachronistic, and their body language is interesting as well. Here's a more conventional one of Stevenson sat smoking. Yes, I know, they didn't know about the link, obviously, with lung disease. But I do want you to notice his very long fingers and those distinctive rings. This is again painted at Skerryvore, where again we have this quote from a biography of Stevenson. His health was never worse than during the Bournemouth days. He seldom went beyond his own garden gate, but lived, as he says, like a weevil in a biscuit. He never worked harder or accomplished more. Kidnapped was also written or finished, certainly, at Bournemouth. He wrote in bed and out of bed, sick or well, poems, plays, short stories and verses. Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, which made him famous at home and abroad. So another very famous output was The Land of Counterpane, a child's garden of verses, illustrated by Jessie Wilcox Smith. We've got all of the tin soldiers. Again, that emphasises how much, in fact, of his life was shaped from childhood by his illness. Also, his overactive Scottish imagination. One of the poems, The Northwest Passage, has the line, "Now my little heart goes a-beating like a drum with the breath of the bogey in my hair." He had a very vivid imagination, seems to have suffered from dreams and nightmares. So again, that all feeds into the birth of Jekyll and Hyde. The other portrayal is by a Samoan artist and obviously shows Stevenson in Samoa, in bed, still writing until the end. So the origin story of Jekyll and Hyde is all about, again, very Freudian, about dreams and nightmares. Fanny claims, in the small hours of one morning, I was awakened by cries of horror from Louis. Thinking he had a nightmare, I awakened him. He said angrily, "Why did you wake me? I was dreaming a fine bogey tale." A bogey in Scottish slang, essentially a spook or a ghost. So again, you can see this very active imagination. And then Louis himself, in a chapter on dreams, describes the origin of Jekyll and Hyde. For 2 days, I went about racking my brains for a plot of any sort. And on the second night, I dreamed the scene at the window, which is, by the way, my illustration, and a scene afterwards split in two, in which Hyde, pursued for some crime, took the powder and underwent the change in the presence of his pursuers. All that was given me was the matter of three scenes and the central idea of a voluntary change becoming involuntary. So at the end of the story, Jekyll runs out of the potion that will turn him back into a normal human being. He gets caught in monstrous form. Now, of course, he came out and he read to the assembled throng his first version of Jekyll and Hyde, and Fanny did not approve. Evidently, an enormous argument ensued, and she said it was just sensationalism and he had missed the entire moral of the story. Again, very Freudian, this idea of a man who feels through his youth a sort of evil within him, wants that evil to become manifest by creating a potion, and then, of course, finding that he can't control the evil within. The evil wins at the end because, of course, he can't turn back into Jekyll. He gets caught as being Hyde. The first artist to illustrate Jekyll and Hyde was Charles Raymond Macaulay in 1904, and I'm showing you the incident at the window. Two of the other friends of Jekyll, Utterson and Enfield, are walking past Jekyll's house, and they look up and they see this sickly figure through the window. In fact, I think it's more his hand than his face, because as the creature Hyde takes more and more control of Jekyll's body, so Jekyll becomes weak and ill, again debilitated by the process of transformation. And it's interesting that Macaulay does not really concentrate on the transformation at all. It's all done through shadows, this wonderful frontispiece that has Jekyll with the shadow of Hyde behind. The hands have become claw-like, as you can see. Or here, scurrying up the staircase with the butler in the corner, terrified by the visage of Hyde, who, in the description of him, has already got sort of simian elements, but is bowed down. He's like almost, not quite crawls, but certainly has this sort of stooped posture, as you can see here in the illustration. Utterson goes in search of Hyde. This is again a wonderful use of shadows. You can see Hyde's shadow on the ground and Utterson's shadow on the door. There's wonderful play here on shadows all the time. And then towards the end of the novella, I saw for the first time the appearance of Edward Hyde. So this is Jekyll looking in the mirror and the revelation that he is Hyde, and the whole idea again of recognition of the evil within, which eventually will gain the upper hand. However, later illustrations and the films themselves will really want to play on the transformation scene of Jekyll becoming Hyde. So this is Beeman's cover for 1930 for the novel, very much, as you can see, focusing on the transformation after the potion has been taken. And that's the theme taken up in the play. So the play was first performed in America. This is one of the posters for it. Again, emphasizing the transformation scene, the poster, and the handsome Jekyll turns into the ugly, deformed image of Hyde, again with that bent spine. So it was Richard Mansfield who got hold of the play and made it his own. Four-act play by Thomas Russell Sullivan was first performed in Boston in 1887 and then opened in London in 1888, interestingly, at the Lyceum. Sir Henry Irving, as he will become, of course, was the Lycee of the Lyceum, and he was very astute. He wanted to have lots of Shakespearean productions, but they were paid for by having melodramas playing in between them. So it's interesting that Jekyll and Hyde was played at the Lyceum. So here is, of course, Richard Mansfield, and here he is in the process of transforming Jekyll into Hyde. And you'll note the importance of the date, 1888. That's the year of Jack the Ripper in Whitechapel. Many people claimed, of course, that Mansfield was Jack the Ripper. They saw him performing Hyde on stage. It was all too much, the coincidence. And he was even questioned by the police. But clearly he had nothing to do with those hideous murders. They, of course, tweaked the story. A love interest has to be introduced. An American actress, Beatrice Cameron, took the part of Agnes Carews. She was created simply to give you that romantic element. Hyde murders Jekyll's fiance's father, and of course it's at that point that Jekyll's friends discover that Jekyll and Hyde are the same person. And then he runs out of the potion and is trapped as Hyde, and in the original play commits suicide before he can be arrested. Again, the moral of the tale. Here's an early illustration. There's Agnes Carew as Miss Cameron. We've got the murderous Hyde running riot all over London. You can easily believe how in 1888 that people could imagine that he was with his cloak, especially Jack the Ripper. The first film version is 1912, and again, very much plays on the transformation scene. I particularly like this famous story of the physician who tasted of the drug that changed one from a good man to an evil one. The consciousness of man who has devoted his life to the saving of human life, a swallow of the drug makes him a beast who would destroy all within his reach. You can imagine that it was quite a spectacle. And it seems that the transformation has a terribly bad effect on his eyebrows and his teeth. And the teeth will become very much a feature of the distortion of Hyde's face as his film persona develops. So here we're 1920 in America, Mr. Sheldon Lewis. I particularly like the coloured version, almost like the yellow 90s, isn't it? But we have a green monster appearing behind the figure of Jekyll. So great morality masterpiece of 1920. John Barrymore has a go at Jekyll and Hyde, but perhaps the most famous one is the Frederick March one of 1931, with Miriam Hopkins as the love interest. Again, teeth seem to be paramount, and this idea of making Hyde very simian, as you can see, with that very pronounced eyebrow ridge and flared nose. Probably couldn't get away with it today. And shadows also play a very important part in Reuben Mamoulian's envisaging or conception of the Jekyll and Hyde story. So the shadows, again, are really important. As we'll see, they are an important image in the book illustrations and in the films like Nosferatu. Anyway, I love this. Frederick March turns in a performance will be remembered for years. Miriam Hopkins shows surefire star talent. But if you ask me, it's those teeth that should really take the Oscar. So here again, just emphasising that he's given, this is Hyde, a very simian appearance. The axes in the background, again, perhaps alluding to the horrors that are associated with Hyde's activities. Anyway, we may not have quite escaped Hyde. So I've already talked about the latest version of Frankenstein, and this is Ridley Scott and Johnny Depp working together, in fact, on a graphic novel. But there is talk that Johnny will come back as Hyde, now, of course, trapped in the body, having run out of potion and running amok over London. What a juicy thought. I can't wait for the film version. Which leads us straight into another man who ran amok, or a dead man, or an undead. Of course, a Dracula created by Bram, Abraham Stoker, Protestant by birth, but with a very biblical name, Abraham or Bram Stoker. Of course, a fellow Irishman. He goes to Trinity College, Dublin, and he's just slightly older than Oscar, because he's a friend of Oscar's brother, Willie Wilde. Like many, he has to take up a decent occupation. He enters the Irish civil service. It's a bit of a dead-end job. So he enjoys writing critical reviews of the theatre. And in December 1876, he'll write a favourable review of Henry Irving's Hamlet at the Theatre Royal in Dublin. Remember that. That's going to help Stoker get the job that will dominate the rest of his life. He will then marry in 1878 Florence Balcombe. Again, here's an interconnection with Oscar Wilde, because she was a former suitor of Wilde. Wilde had famously fallen in love with her, drawn her, as you can see down the bottom, and gifted her a little gold crucifix. However, of course, she marries Bram Stoker. He's in a much better position in terms of marriageable material in 1878. And they will move the following year to St Leonard's Terrace in Chelsea. And it's in the same period that he'll become personal assistant of Sir Henry Irving and be his business manager at the Lyceum Theatre for 27 years. And it was the fact that Stoker was worked to death by Irving that has alleged that Irving is the basis for Dracula. Dracula literally, or I should say Irving, literally sucked Bram Stoker dry. So here is the beautiful Florence Balcombe, but also their home in Chelsea. So here is Henry Irving. He has lots of connections to Bournemouth because he would go there to recover. He was a workaholic and frequently went down to Bournemouth to recover from flu or pleurisy or whatever other ailment he was suffering from. We have lots of letters back and forth. He didn't like being down in Bournemouth. He much preferred life in London. And there's a lot of connections between Sir Henry Irving and the Russell Coates House and Museum, because Sir Merton Russell Coates, who was the proprietor of the Royal Bath Hotel, really appreciated having this star come and stay with him. And when Irving died, he will buy a lot at Irving's posthumous sale, which is now all in the Irving Room at the Russell Coates Art Gallery in Bournemouth. However, despite his love of Shakespeare, what really made Irving famous was another ghost or horror story. 1871, The Bells. It was this play that was going to make Irving's reputation. It's a particularly unpleasant scenario. Its subtitle is The Polish Jew. And Matthias is an innkeeper. The Polish Jew rocks up one night on his sleigh, and Matthias murders him and throws him down a well to get his money, obviously. But then Matthias is haunted by the bells of the murdered Jewish merchant. Here's a cartoon of Irving hearing the bells, because when you went to see the play, you couldn't hear the bells. It was only Irving who could hear the bells that increasingly drive him towards madness. And the denouement of the play is that Matthias stroke Irving hangs himself in the course of a violent nightmare. During the first performances, one woman is said to have literally fainted from the horror of seeing Irving playing the part of Matthias, literally committing suicide on stage. He had very beautiful legs, according to Oscar Wilde. There's one lovely quote where Wilde says that Irving's legs, one is beautiful, but the other was a poem. I leave you to decide in my two cartoons. The one by Ape is again shows you he was very tall, his distinctive look. So, rather amusingly, despite the great success of the Bells, Florence, who was the girl that was supposed to marry Oscar Wilde, didn't think too much of it. As they drove home on the opening night, Florence said to Irving, "Are you going on making a fool of yourself like this all your life?" referring to the Bells. She was then pregnant with their second son, Lawrence. Irving got out of the carriage at Hyde Park Corner, walked off into the night, and never saw her again. There was a messy divorce. He then became embroiled with a very long affair with Ellen Terry, who's painted here by Edward Matthew Hale at the time she was living at Halliford-on-Thames. There's a photograph that shows you how close the portrayal is. But this again you'll find in the Russell Coates Museum, and Ellen will become Irving's leading lady in more ways than one for the rest of his life. So Irving was often to be found at the Royal Bath Hotel. I'm afraid it's only a shade of its former glory. I particularly like this puffed up advert for it, thanks to Sir Merton Russell Coates. Mr. Ritz of the Carlton and Hyde Park Hotels, London, and the Hotel Ritz, Paris, says, "I shall be delighted to recommend the Royal Bath Hotel whenever the opportunity occurs." So clearly it was the place to stay in Bournemouth. Irving was seen to be very much a friend of the family, according to Sir Merton and his wife Annie, Lady Annie Russell Coates. He was invited to lay the foundations of this marble fountain in the garden. It's in the grotto area of the Russell Coates House and Museum. And he will later come back, and with that strange implement at the top of the slide, he will actually open the fountain and the water will flow. A little silver trowel was made to commemorate the event. And if you go to visit the Russell Coates, in the Irving room, you'll find all sorts of memorabilia relating particularly to his Shakespearean roles. So I love some quotes from the letters that I pulled out. In April 1892, here I am too for my sins. Quite like that idea. I suppose he's referring to the fact that he'd been overworking. 1895, he has influenza. 1898, writing back to London, we have the wonderful quote, "Bournemouth is banishment." At his posthumous sale, so Sir Merton bought lots of things for his Irving room, including this magnificent and very large portrait of Irving in the role of Charles I. It's by James Archer. And the sketch of them all buying at the sale is by Sidney Paget, famous illustrator. And as you can see, the guy in the middle is holding up the armour that was used by Irving, I think, in his portrayal of Hamlet. A direct link between the Royal Bath Hotel and Dracula is this famous aphorism. So this was painted in the lobby of the Royal Bath Hotel. It's a quote from Homer's Odyssey, originally addressed by Menelaus to his guest Telemachus, who is eager to leave so he can avoid being murdered on his way home. And it was on the balcony of the lobby of the Royal Bath Hotel. "Welcome the coming, speed the parting guest." And Bram Stoker will steal that and put it on the lips of Count Dracula. Again, a cartoon from Punch. "Welcome the coming and speed the parting guest." Let's hope he didn't meet Dracula on the way. Initially, of course, it's not illustrated, and the actual idea of creating Dracula was partly inspired by visiting Whitby in 1890, those famous 100 steps up to the Abbey, but certainly gives you a spooky background for where Dracula is supposed to arrive on English shores. He starts to write Dracula, however, in 1895. It's often been said there's a link to Oscar Wilde's Three Trials. Again, because there's supposed to be all sorts of homoerotic and homosexual subtexts in Dracula that various authorities have pulled out. The first illustrated cover, courtesy of Constable and Company, is in 1901 and shows Dracula, as you can see, climbing up a wall down from his victim. In order to protect its copyright, 8 days before the novel was published, Dracula was performed on stage. And this was really because, particularly in America, it would have been pirated and performed on stage, and the copyright would have been very difficult to control. So, interestingly enough, Dracula is first performed at the Lyceum. Remember, Henry Irving. All of this is becoming rather circular. And it was performed by, Mina was performed by Edith Craig, who was Ellen Terry's daughter. Here you see a photograph of them. It sounds to have been rather boring because, as you can see, it was a prologue and 5 acts. In effect, they were basically just reading out the text of Dracula. The whole thing was just to ensure that the copyright for the stage play was secured. And of course, the copyright was an issue when the famous Nosferatu film was produced in 1922. Florence Stoker, Bram's widow, fought for 10 years over the copyright. Count Dracula becomes Count Orlok in Nosferatu. And this is Max Schreck's portrayal. Again, look how important the sort of, not just the skeletal look of the Count, but particularly the importance of those shadows. And the most recent version, Skarsgård, as you can see, has reprised the original Nosferatu very closely. But again, keeping it in the family, Lily Rose Depp plays the part of Mina. So here's another horror for you to watch over Christmas. The first authorised adaptation of Stoker's Dracula performed on stage was by Hamilton Dean and was revised for 1927 and brought to Broadway with Bela Lugosi, of course, starring. And he will become one of the cinema's most famous actors to portray Dracula. Here is, in fact, the poster for the Universal film. I love the Bela Lugosi image that he created. So you can see that there's all sorts of things coming together. Now, the link to, of course, Dorian Gray is the fact that Oscar might have been looking at an early copy of it or the proofs for it, because we know that he was in Bournemouth in April 1891. We know that he signed the visitor's book and he was there without his family or without any other lovers. That comes later. It may well be, as it was published in book form in April 1891, that Wilde was there again from overwork and wanted to go down to Bournemouth to recover. He famously refers to the air in Bournemouth as ozone, which I like. The origins, again, of the picture of Dorian Gray, really wants to call it portrait, again goes back to Lippincotts, an American magazine in 1890. There's a meeting in London between the editor of Lippincotts magazine and two famous authors. One is Oscar Wilde, the other is Sir Conan Doyle. Out of that meeting, Dorian Gray is invented, and so too is Sherlock Holmes. So a very useful luncheon. Anyway, just to show you again how important the shadows are, here is an early illustrated version of Dorian. This is Henry Keane's illustrated version, 1925. Wonderful cover of a Oscar Wilde sunflower and a Whistler butterfly. But look at the image of Dorian walking up the stairs to the locked room with that wonderful shadow behind that seems to pull out the evil within. The beautiful young man on the frontispiece, those wonderful butterflies again, always make me think of Whistler. And here at the denouement, where, of course, Dorian takes his own life. He is stabbed, but he has reverted back into his natural form. He is now aged, and the only way that his body can be identified is through those rings, as you can see here on Dorian's hands. The hands and the rings, again, are a very interesting metaphor in all of these horror stories. So my final section is on Aubrey Beardsley because, of course, there's a link to Oscar Wilde. He will illustrate Salome, but he too will go down to Bournemouth to try to recover his health. The enfant terrible of the 1890s with his pudding haircut painted by Sickert a wonderful cartoon with those, again, very distinctive hands, is by Max Beerbohm. He spent his early years struggling as a clerk. A wonderful quote from Wilde: "A monstrous orchid with a face like a silver hatchet and green grass hair," photographed by Frederick Evans as the famous gargoyle from Notre Dame. In the illustration by Beardsley himself, exquisite sensibility crushed by the realities of existence. He's having to make a living when he would really like to be an artist. And initially, in the early mid 1880s, he makes his career as an infant prodigy. His mother was a piano teacher, and he started out really as an infant performer, which must have been very difficult because, of course, he again contracts TB at a very young age. He was also, as you can see, a bit of a dandy. So just to remind you, his career takes off in 1893 when he gets not only the front cover of the studio, but also is able to illustrate Salome by putting in an illustration. This is the denouement: "I have kissed your lips, Joachim." So it is Salome kissing the beheaded lips of John the Baptist. And yes, the punt works because, of course, he gets the commission to illustrate Salome. Here is the frontis. Again, wonderful image of Oscar Wilde as the man in the moon. Note the vertical Japanese signature that Beardsley was using at this time. He then, of course, becomes editor of the Yellow Book. It seems to sum up, in fact, the decadence of the 1890s. A warning to women of how dangerous it is to read. I love the Pirot in the background, but anyway, the Yellow Book. But of course, all of that comes to a rapid conclusion with Oscar Wilde's trials in 1895. 3 altogether, you will recall. Closing scenes at the Old Bailey reminds you of Oscar in America with his wonderful velvet breeches. There he is in the dock, his contents of Tite Street being sold. Dorian Gray, of course, was used in the trial as evidence against him. Again, all sorts of immoralities were tweaked or were pulled out, I should say, of Dorian. At the top we have his nemesis, of course, the Marquis of Queensberry. But essentially, this is the reason why the decadents have to go underground. So all of Beardsley's later work is for the Savoy. Here's number 1. Arthur Symonds was the editor. Leonard Smithers was in charge of the finances. That's John Bull, by the way, at the top, but not your traditional John Bull. So Arthur William Symonds, a major figure in the decadence of the 1890s, will edit with Beardsley the Savoy magazine. People like Yeats, Bernard Shaw and Joseph Conrad, they're all, of course, important contributors. Smithers himself claims, "I will publish the things that others are afraid to touch." And Smithers encourages Beardsley's interest in French, Latin and Greek texts, which leads to Aristophanes' play Lysistrata and the satires of the Roman poet Juvenal, in other words, to those late, rather pornographic works. And we know that when Beardsley arrives in Boscombe in August of 1896, hoping that the air or ozone will restore his health, that he'd been working on this, the frontispiece for the comedy of the Rheingold, as in Wagner. He'll stay at the Pier Hotel, which has long gone, and a good view of the pier at Boscombe. So a bit of nostalgia for those of us who know Bournemouth quite well. Here is the Sea Road at Boscombe. It's completely transformed today. The Pier Hotel is the one with the rather nice loggia on the front here, the arcade. That's the Pier Hotel. There it is in colour. Side view of it down the bottom, and from it, Beardsley, as he was hopefully recovering his health, got a very good view, as you can see, of the pier itself. It's whilst he's in Boscombe, however, that he decides to convert to Roman Catholicism. He will become friendly with the novelist Eleanor Ashworth Towell, who was married to the vicar at St Clement's, Bournemouth. There must have been a lot of discussion about his conversion. I think Beardsley befriended her because he really wanted to meet Lady Shelley, and perhaps sees some items belonging to Percy Shelley, her father-in-law. He visits Corpus Christi Church. This is in Boscombe. We also know that he visits the Sacred Heart Church, which is actually in Bournemouth proper. And perhaps it was suffering a hemorrhage in December 1896, which was a turning point really in his health, that convinces Beardsley to convert to Roman Catholic. And he'll move from Boscombe to Bournemouth allegedly because the air is better. I'm not convinced about that. And in March 1897, he'll be received into the Catholic Church. At this point, he asks Smithers to destroy all those obscene drawings, particularly for Lysistrata, which of course Smithers ignores. He will live here at Muriel Road, Exeter, again, sadly long gone. So this is Muriel Road, sorry, Muriel, it's the name of the villa on Exeter Road in Bournemouth. So X marks the spot if you go to visit today. It's rather nice. Again, mural in this case, made in mosaic, courtesy of Tarmac, to mark the place where the house Muriel once was, based on his drawing Autumn. So I'm going to finish, in fact, with some ghost stories or horror stories relating to Aubrey Beardsley, like this one here, A Kiss of Judas, a vampire horror story by Julian Osgood Field, published in the Pall Mall Gazette in 1893. The image of the rather grotesque baby that looks rather like a fetus, if you don't mind me saying so, is kissing the hand of a sleeping person. So that, again, the androgyny of the figure, you're not quite sure if it's male or female, the Kiss of Judas. Still an element of Whistler, I think, in that design. Then illustrations for Edgar Allan Poe for an American company, Herbert Stone. There are actually only 4 illustrations in this volume. The others by Beardsley, the others are in fact pastiches in his style. I particularly like the murders in the Rue Morgue. If you remember, it's a giant ape. I love the way the ape who's cutting off the young lady has got a chandelier earring. And we have a very potent image, I think, of Poe himself. Here, The Black Cat, which is a particularly horrible story about a man who turns on his pets, takes out the eye of his black cat, eventually hangs said black cat, and then the black cat gets his revenge because whilst he's trying to hang the cat, the wife intervenes or tries to intervene, and the protagonist in our story murders his wife. He then tries to hide the body by walling it up, but it is the cries of the cat that tell the local authorities that the poor dead woman has been walled up. I love the poster for the film where we bring together, as you can see, Karloff and Bela Lugosi in Edgar Allan Poe's The Black Cat. Remember, I have 3. Or here, The Mask of the Red Death, which makes me think of Hammer Horror and Vincent Price in particular. Wonderful illustration by Beardsley. And finally, Beardsley's own poem, The Ballad of the Barber, shows that he too had a macabre sense, a carefully wrought and chilling fable, a 13-year-old princess and a Sweeney Todd-like coiffeur who slits her throat with the jagged glass of a broken bottle of cologne, meaning scent, and then creeps away on pointed feet. So illustrated by Beardsley, but most importantly, the poem written by Beardsley. You might not have thought of him as a poet. That's from 1896. So you can see that he has, like some of the other fellow habitués of Bournemouth, a dark side. However, he doesn't die in Bournemouth. He leaves in January 1897. He goes to Menton. This image of him in his hotel room in Menton, he'll die in March 1898, perhaps gives you an idea of what his rooms might have looked like in Boscombe or Bournemouth. All of his Mantegna prints, his own drawings, his crucifix, as you can see, and those 2 candles to either side, again, quasi-religious. And there, of course, his final resting place in Menton, if you wish to go in search of Beardsley. The churchyard at St. Peter's might be slightly easier to go in search of Mary Shelley, and you might want to pop in, particularly this time of the year as it's chilly, for a hot chocolate or a coffee in the Wetherspoons. Mary Shelley Wetherspoons, I mean. But I hope you've enjoyed your Christmas horror stories. Hopefully, it will put you in the mood for the BBC Christmas ghost story, which has itself become something of a tradition. But may I wish you a very happy Christmas, and hopefully you won't have too many horrible nightmares that might bring up all sorts of ghosts and ghouls. Thank you.